Wyoming Territory, 1872. The land was a study in silence, a vast and lonely canvas painted in strokes of ochre, sage, and the deep, bruised purple of distant mountains. The wind was the only constant voice, a low whisper that swept down from the high peaks and across the plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and pine and the bitter chill of places that never fully thawed. It was a land that demanded resilience and offered little in return but space. Enough space for a man to lose himself completely, or to be reminded, with every sunrise, of just how alone he truly was. Elias Thorne knew that loneliness better than any man. It was etched into the lines around his eyes and settled in the set of his shoulders. His ranch was a solitary outpost, nestled in a valley that cupped it like a protective hand against the harshest of the winds. The log house was sturdy, built by his own hands, and the barn stood sentinel beside it. From his porch, he could see for miles in every direction, a kingdom of emptiness that he had carved out for himself. He had chosen this life, or so he told himself. He had chosen the silence, the hard work that left a man too tired to think, the isolation that served as a fortress against the ghosts of a life that had been stolen from him. He finished mending a split rail in the corral fence, the familiar rhythm of the hammer a dull comfort. His movements were economical, efficient, stripped of any wasted energy. He had learned long ago that wastefulness, whether of motion or of emotion, was a luxury he could not afford. The world had taught him that lesson with a brutal finality. He straightened up, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of a leather glove, and his gaze drifted toward the small, fenced-off plot of land on the rise behind the house. Two simple wooden markers stood there, their edges softened by sun and snow. Sarah and Lily. The names were a dull ache in his chest, a wound that had scarred over but never truly healed. He had built this ranch for them, a dream of a future that had turned to ash in a single season of fever. Now, he maintained it as a kind of penance, a monument to what he had lost. He believed attachment was a weakness. Love was a vulnerability, a door left open for pain to walk right in. He had locked that door and thrown away the key, content to live within the walls he had built around his heart. He had his work, his land, and the stoic companionship of his housekeeper, Martha, a widow whose own quiet grief seemed to understand his without the need for words. It was enough. It had to be. A sound, thin and sharp, cut through the afternoon stillness. It was a sound that did not belong to this land of wind and horses and the cry of hawks. It was the whistle of the train, a shrill announcement of the world beyond his valley, the world he had turned his back on. Twice a week it sliced through the silence of Redemption Creek, the dusty little town a few miles away, spitting out mail, supplies, and the occasional foolhardy soul who thought they could tame this country. To Elias, it was just noise, a periodic reminder of the life he had escaped. He rarely paid it any mind. But today, for some reason he could not name, the sound felt different. It felt like a premonition, a disturbance in the carefully ordered quiet of his existence. He finished his work, his movements a little tighter now, an unfamiliar tension coiled in his gut. The whistle faded, but the silence that returned felt heavier, expectant. Later that afternoon, he rode into Redemption Creek, his supply list tucked into his pocket. The town was little more than a single dusty street flanked by a dozen wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office. The train was just pulling away from the small depot, a black serpent of smoke and steel disappearing into the vast horizon. Its departure left a vacuum, a sense of anticlimax that always hung in the air after it was gone. And then he saw her. She stood on the station platform as if she had been painted into the wrong landscape. Her dress was the color of a summer sky, a fine blue wool that was hopelessly out of place against the dun-colored dust. A matching hat with a small, neat feather was perched atop a cascade of honey-blonde hair, pinned in a careful arrangement that was already beginning to surrender to the persistent wind. She held a small, gloved hand up to shield her eyes, her posture straight and proud, yet he could see the weary slump in her shoulders, the faint tremor in her hand. She was scanning the sparse collection of wagons and horses, her expression a mixture of hope and rising anxiety. Elias watched from a distance, his hand resting on his saddle horn. He was a student of his environment, and she was an anomaly, a delicate songbird in a land of eagles and crows. He saw the station master, Mr. Gable, a man whose face was a roadmap of Wyoming weather, say something to her. She shook her head, her reply lost to the wind, but the graceful line of her throat tightened. The hope in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by a stark, dawning realization. She was alone, stranded. He knew he should turn his horse toward the general store. It was not his business. He had long ago sworn off involving himself in the troubles of others. And yet, he did not move. He watched as she clutched her reticule, her knuckles white. She looked small and fragile against the immense, indifferent backdrop of the territory. He saw the precise moment her composure began to shatter, not in a storm of tears, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible crumbling of her poise. Her shoulders drooped, her chin lowered, and she took a half-step back, as if the sheer emptiness of the place was a physical force pushing against her. She turned, her movements wooden, and did not see the uneven edge of the wooden platform. Her heel caught, and with a soft cry of surprise, she pitched forward. Tom seemed to slow. Elias reacted without thought, his body moving with an instinct he thought he had buried long ago. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He caught her just as she was about to fall into the dusty street. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The impact was a shock to his system. She was light, far lighter than he would have imagined, but she felt solid and real in his arms. He was overwhelmed by a sudden rush of sensations he had not allowed himself to feel in years. The scent of lavender and starch, a clean, sweet smell that was the antithesis of his world of leather and horse and dust. The surprising softness of her wool dress against the hard muscle of his arms. The warmth of her body seeping through his shirt. For a brief, dizzying moment, he was holding life in his arms again, and the feeling was so foreign, so powerful, it was like a lightning strike to his soul. Clara Davenport's world had narrowed to a terrifying point of dust and sky. One moment she was standing on the platform, the cold dread of abandonment seeping into her bones. The next, she was falling. She braced for the impact, for the hard, unforgiving ground of this new and terrible place. But instead of pain, she felt the jarring, solid strength of a man's arms. She landed against a chest as unyielding as an oak tree, and for a second, the air was forced from her lungs. Her hat was knocked askew, and her carefully pinned hair tumbled loose around her shoulders. She was held fast, her cheek pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear, a rhythm that was slow and strong and utterly grounding. The scent of him filled her senses, leather, clean sweat, and something else, something uniquely masculine and wild, like the pine-scented wind. He was real. He was solid. In a world that had just dissolved into uncertainty, he was the only firm thing to hold on to. He held her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, his grip firm and protective. Then, as if realizing what he was doing, he loosened his hold, steadying her on her feet. "Careful there, miss," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges like weathered stone. Clara stepped back, her face flushed with embarrassment, her hands fluttering to straighten her dress and fix her hair. "Thank you," she stammered, her own voice sounding thin and reedy to her ears. She finally looked up at him, truly looked at him, and her breath caught. He was tall, broader than she had imagined, with shoulders that strained the seams of his cotton shirt. His face was all harsh angles and sun-weathered lines, his jaw firm and shadowed with stubble. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a stormy sky, a deep gray that seemed to hold a universe of sorrow and a fierce, guarded intelligence. They assessed her in a single, sweeping glance, and she felt impossibly transparent, as if he could see right through to the foolish, hopeful girl who had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of a liar's promise. "You seem to be in some trouble," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. The directness of his words, devoid of pity or condescension, broke through her shock. The tears she had been holding back pricked at her eyes. "The man I was supposed to meet. He is not here," she said, the words sounding pathetic and naive. "His name is Mr. Thompson." Jonathan Thompson. Elias's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, passed through his eyes. "There is no Jonathan Thompson in Redemption Creek," he said flatly. "Never has been." The finality of his statement was like a physical blow. It confirmed the cold suspicion that had been growing in her heart for the last hour. The letters, the promises of a new life, of a respectable marriage to a man who owned a prosperous mercantile business. It had all been a lie. A cruel, elaborate fiction designed to lure her west, away from everything she knew. She swayed slightly, the world tilting on its axis. "Mom." His hand shot out, not touching her, but hovering near her elbow, ready to steady her again. Just then, a stout, gray-haired woman bustled out of the general store, a basket on her arm. It was Martha, Elias's housekeeper. She took in the scene at a glance. The pale, elegantly dressed young woman and Elias's tense, protective stance. "Elias? Is everything all right?" "This lady has been stranded, Martha," he said, his voice still low and even. Martha's expression softened with immediate sympathy. She moved to Clara's side, her presence warm and maternal. "Oh, you poor dear. Come now. You look like you are about to faint. The wind is picking up something fierce. A storm is coming." She looked from Clara's pale face to the darkening clouds that were gathering over the mountains, a bruised and turbulent mass that mirrored the turmoil in Clara's soul. "You cannot stay out here. The only boarding house is above the saloon. It is no place for a lady." Clara looked from the kind woman to the stoic man beside her. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She was utterly at the mercy of strangers in a land that seemed determined to swallow her whole. The first fat drop of rain hit the dusty ground beside her foot, sending up a puff of dirt. Elias seemed to be having an internal battle. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She could almost see the walls going up in his stormy eyes, the reluctance to get involved warring with some deeper, buried instinct. Finally, he let out a slow breath, a sound of resignation. "Martha is right," he said, his gaze returning to her. "You can come with us. My ranch is a few miles from here. You will be safe there until you can sort things out." The offer was a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. It was improper, of course. A young, unmarried woman staying at a bachelor's home was scandalous. But this was not Boston, and propriety seemed a foolish luxury in the face of her current predicament. The presence of the older woman, Martha, offered a thin veneer of respectability that she clung to. I could not possibly impose," Clara began, the polite refusal automatic on her lips. "It is not an imposition," Elias cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is a necessity. The storm will be on us in an hour." He gestured to her trunk on the platform. "I will get your things." He moved with that same decisive grace, lifting the heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing and securing it to the back of his wagon. Clara allowed Martha to guide her to the wagon, her mind a numb whirl of fear and a strange, unfamiliar flicker of gratitude. She sat on the hard wooden seat, her fine dress feeling ridiculous and flimsy against the rough-hewn reality of her surroundings. Elias climbed up beside her, taking the reins. He smelled of the approaching rain now, a clean, earthy scent. He did not speak, his profile sharp and unyielding as he urged the horses forward. The wagon wheels creaked, a mournful sound that seemed to mark the beginning of a journey into a future she could not possibly have imagined. The first crack of thunder rolled across the plains, and the sky opened up, washing the world in a torrent of cold, hard rain. The journey to the ranch was made in a tense, wind-swept silence, broken only by the drumming of rain on the canvas cover Elias had pulled over them and the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels. Clara huddled in her thin wool coat, shivering more from shock than from a cold. Martha had tried to make small talk, but Clara's monosyllabic answers had eventually trailed off into the roar of the storm. The man beside her, Elias, remained a silent, formidable presence. He handled the horses with a quiet confidence, his large hands sure on the reins, his gaze fixed on the muddy track ahead. She stole glances at him, at the way the rain slicked his dark hair to his head and dripped from the brim of his hat. He seemed a part of the storm, as elemental and untamed as the land itself. When they finally arrived, the ranch house emerged from the gray curtain of rain like a haven. It was a simple, sturdy structure of dark logs, with smoke curling from a stone chimney, a golden promise of warmth within. Elias helped her down, his hand briefly closing over hers. His touch was calloused and warm, a fleeting connection that sent another unexpected jolt through her. Inside, a fire was already blazing in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the main room. The space was rustic but impeccably clean, dominated by a long wooden table, a few handmade chairs, and shelves filled with books. It was a masculine space, functional and sparse, but Martha's touch was evident in the braided rug on the floor and the pot of herbs on the windowsill. "Let me get you out of those wet things, dear," Martha said, bustling Clara toward the fire. "Elias, bring in her trunk. I will put her in the spare room." Elias nodded and disappeared back into the storm, returning moments later with her trunk, which he set down with ease. He did not linger, retreating to the barn to see to the horses, leaving her in Martha's capable hands. The housekeeper fussed over her, providing her with a warm, dry quilt and a cup of hot tea that helped to chase some of the chill from her bones. She showed Clara to a small, simple room with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto the rain-lashed valley. It was more a cell than a guest room, but it was clean and dry and safe. Later, as the storm began to subside, replaced by a gentle, steady drumming on the roof, the three of them sat down to a simple supper of beef stew and fresh bread. The food was hearty and delicious, and Clara found she was ravenous. The silence at the table was less tense than it had been in the wagon, filled now with the comfortable sounds of clinking spoons and the crackle of the fire. It was Elias who finally broke it. "You said you were meeting a man," he said, his gaze steady on her across the table. "This Thompson, what did he promise you?" Clara set her spoon down, her appetite suddenly gone. She took a deep breath, the shame of her own foolishness rising in her throat. But there was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet, patient waiting. And so she told him. She spoke of her life in Boston, of being an orphan raised by a stern, unloving aunt. She told him of the small inheritance her parents had left her, a sum that had made her feel like a burden in her aunt's house. Then she spoke of the letters. They had started arriving 6 months ago from a man named Jonathan Thompson, who claimed to be a friend of her late father. His letters were eloquent and kind, painting a picture of a thriving town in the West and a prosperous future. He had a nephew, he wrote, a good, hardworking man who was looking for a wife. The correspondence had blossomed, filled with promises and dreams. The uncle, Silas Croft, had orchestrated the entire thing, arranging her travel, promising to meet her upon arrival. It had all seemed so perfect, a respectable escape from her lonely existence. Silas Croft, Elias said, his voice low. The name seemed to mean something to him. He exchanged a look with Martha, a quick, almost imperceptible glance that spoke volumes. He said he was Mr. Thompson's uncle, Clara clarified, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. There's a Silas Croft in this territory, Elias said slowly. A cattle baron with a reputation for greed. He owns a great deal of land north of here, but he has no family to speak of, and he is not a man to be trusted. The truth of it settled over her, cold and heavy. It was the inheritance, she whispered, the pieces clicking into place. He must have found out about my inheritance. The letters, they were all a lie. There is no nephew. There is no mercantile. There is only Silas Croft. She had wired the bulk of her money ahead, to an account Croft had set up for her supposed fiancé. She had been left with only enough for emergencies. She was not just stranded, she was nearly destitute. The humiliation was a bitter taste in her mouth. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see pity or scorn on their faces when she looked up. But when she dared to meet Elias's gaze, she saw something else entirely. A deep, resonant empathy. The sorrow in his eyes seemed to recognize her own. "My parents died of influenza when I was 16, she said quietly, the confession feeling necessary, an explanation for her naivety. "I have been alone for a very long time. I suppose I wanted to believe in the promise of a family so badly that I did not see the deception in front of me." The room was silent for a long moment. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Elias leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. "I know what it is to lose family," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He did not elaborate, but the simple statement was a bridge between them, a shared acknowledgement of loss that transcended the differences in their worlds. He spoke of the fever that had swept through the valley 5 years before, a merciless plague that had taken many. He did not mention a wife or child, but he spoke of neighbors and friends, of a time when the silence of his ranch had been a new and terrible thing. "This land takes as much as it gives," he concluded, his gaze distant, lost in a memory she could not see. In that quiet moment, something shifted between them. He was no longer just a gruff, intimidating stranger. She saw the man beneath the hardened exterior, a man who had been shaped by grief, who had chosen solitude as a shield. And he, in turn, saw past the refined Eastern lady to the resilient, courageous woman who had faced down her own loss and was now facing a new and terrifying reality with a quiet dignity. A fragile seed of mutual respect had been planted in the barren ground of their shared sorrow. "You can stay here," Elias said, his voice firm again, pulling him back from the edge of his memories. "As long as you need. Martha will be here. You will be safe." It was not a question, but a declaration. And for the first time since stepping off that train, Clara felt a flicker of something that was not fear. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it felt unmistakably like hope. She had lost a false dream, but in this stranger's home, surrounded by the vast, intimidating wilderness, she had found an unexpected and profound kindness. The days that followed settled into a strange and quiet routine. Clara, determined not to be a burden, insisted on helping Martha with the household chores. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, from the pre-dawn darkness when Elias would rise to see to the livestock, to the quiet evenings spent by the fire. At first, her hands, accustomed to embroidering needles and the delicate pages of books, were clumsy with the rougher tasks. She fumbled with kneading dough, her knuckles aching. She struggled to mend one of Elias's thick-work shirts, her stitches uneven. But she was a determined student, and Martha was a patient teacher. Clara discovered a resilience within herself she had never known. The crisp, clean air filled her lungs, and the hard work, while exhausting, was also satisfying. She found a simple pleasure in hanging laundry on the line and watching it snap in the constant wind, the white sheets brilliant against the deep blue sky. She learned to tell the difference between the cry of a hawk and the call of an eagle. The land, which had at first seemed so menacing and empty, began to reveal its subtle beauty to her. The way the light changed on the mountains throughout the day, the myriad colors of the wildflowers that grew along the creek bed, the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky. Elias remained a distant figure. He was polite, always ensuring she had everything she needed, but he kept his emotional distance. He would leave before sunrise and often return after dusk, his face etched with fatigue. He spoke little, his words practical and direct. Yet, Clara found herself watching him. She saw the gentleness with which he handled his horses, the quiet pride he took in his land, the way his gaze would sometimes linger on the horizon, a deep melancholy settling over his features. She sensed the immense depth of the sorrow he carried, a weight that he bore alone. She began to understand that his silence was not a sign of indifference, but a carefully constructed wall. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode out from town. He was a tall, lanky man with a kind face and a weary slump to his shoulders, a a man who had seen too much trouble in his time. He sat with Elias on the porch, their voices a low murmur. Clara, who was tending to the small vegetable garden Martha kept, could not help but overhear snippets of their conversation. Two strangers in town, Elias, the sheriff said, his voice grave, asking questions. They came in on the train the day after the lady arrived, asking about a woman from Boston, matching her description. Elias's body went still. What kind of men? Rough sort. Hired guns by the look of them. They claim they are looking for a runaway sister, but they have the look of wolves on the hunt. I told them no one of that description was in town, but they are sniffing around. I have a feeling they are working for your man, Croft. A cold knot of fear formed in Clara's stomach. They were looking for her. Silas Croft had sent men to find her. She straightened up, her hands covered in dirt, and looked toward the porch. Elias's back was to her, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He was like a predator that had scented danger. After the sheriff left, Elias sought her out. He found her by the creek, where she had gone to wash the dirt from her hands. Sheriff Brody was here, he said, his voice flat. I heard, she replied, not looking at him, her gaze fixed on the clear water swirling around her fingers. They are looking for me. Yes, he stood a few feet away, his presence a solid, imposing shadow. Croft must want the rest of your money. Or perhaps he just wants to ensure your silence. The implication was terrifying. She had thought, foolishly, that once he had her inheritance, he would be done with her. But men like that, men who built empires on greed, did not leave loose ends. What should I do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. You should stay here, where you are safe, he said, his tone resolute. They will not come onto my land. They know better. There was a quiet confidence in his words that was both reassuring and unsettling. This man was capable of a violence she could only imagine. A few days later, the threat moved from a rumor in town to a physical presence. Elias was out riding the fence line on the far edge of his property when he saw them. Two riders, watching his house from a distant ridge. They were the men the sheriff had described, their silhouettes hard and menacing against the skyline. Elias did not ride toward them. Instead, he simply stopped his horse and watched them back, his hand resting casually on the rifle in his saddle scabbard. It was a silent, primal challenge, a drawing of lines in the dust. After a long, tense moment, the two men turned their horses and rode away, disappearing over the ridge. Elias did not mention the incident to Clara, but she noticed a change in him. He stayed closer to the ranch. His rifle was never far from his hand, and his watchful gaze seemed to be constantly scanning the surrounding hills. The wall around him seemed to grow higher, thicker. He was protecting her, she knew, but his method of protection was to retreat further into himself. The fragile connection they had forged by the fire seemed to be dissolving, replaced by the grim reality of the danger she had brought to his door. The tension came to a head one bright, sunny afternoon. Believing the threat had passed, and desperate for a few moments of peace, Clara had wandered farther from the house than usual, following the winding path of the creek to a small grove of aspen trees where she had discovered a patch of vibrant Indian paintbrush. She was gathering a small bouquet, her mind blessedly empty for the first time in days, when the sound of snapping twigs made her jump. The two men emerged from the trees, blocking her path back to the house. They were just as the sheriff had described them, rough, unkempt, with cold, predatory eyes. The taller one had a cruel smirk on his face. Well, look what we have here, he drawled, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. The little lost bird from Boston. Mr. Croft sends his regards. He is very eager to have a word with you. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand her ground. Her finishing school education had not prepared her for this, but the resilience she had discovered on the ranch rose to the surface. I have nothing to say to Mr. Croft, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Oh, I think you do, the second man grunted, taking a step closer. He seems to think you have something that belongs to him. A small matter of a few $100s you kept for yourself. He considers that very rude. That money is mine, she retorted, her chin high. The first man laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. That is a matter of opinion. Now, you can come with us quietly, or we can get unpleasant. Your protector is not here to save you this time. He lunged for her, his dirty hand reaching for her arm. Clara cried out and stumbled backward, tripping over a tree root. She fell hard, the wildflowers scattering around her. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her defiance. She was trapped. Suddenly, a voice, low and deadly as a rattlesnake's warning, cut through the air. Get away from her. Elias stood at the edge of the grove, not 20 yards away. He must have returned early and seen her head for the creek. He held his rifle in his hands, not aimed, but held with a familiarity that was more threatening than any overt gesture. His face was a thunderous mask of fury, his gray eyes blazing with a cold fire that made the air crackle. The two men froze, their smirks vanishing. They had not expected him. They slowly raised their hands, a clear acknowledgement of the shift in power. Now, Thorn, we do not want any trouble, the tall one said, his voice losing its confident drawl. We just have business with the lady. Her business is my business, Elias said, his voice lethally soft. He took a slow step forward, the rifle seeming to become an extension of his body. And my business is telling you to get off my land. Now, before I forget that I am a civilized man, there was nothing civilized in his eyes. What Clara saw, there was pure, primal rage, a protective instinct so fierce it was terrifying. The two thugs saw it too. They exchanged a nervous glance, then slowly began to back away. You will not be able to watch her forever, Thorn, the second man snarled, trying to regain a shred of bravado. I will not have to, Elias replied, his voice dropping even lower. If I see either of you on my property again, I will not give you a warning. The threat hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. The two men turned and scrambled away, disappearing into the trees like startled coyotes. The immediate danger was gone, but the clearing was filled with a new, suffocating tension. Elias stood for a moment, his chest rising and falling heavily, before he finally lowered the rifle. He walked over to where Clara was still sitting on the ground, her dress smudged with dirt. He reached down and pulled her to her feet, his grip on her arm almost painfully tight. He did not release her immediately. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, his jaw clenched. The rage was still there, but underneath it was something else, something that looked terrifyingly like fear. The raw, visceral fear of a man who had just come close to losing something precious. And that fear was what undid him. It was a reminder of the vulnerability he had sworn to never feel again. The terror of losing her, this woman who had somehow slipped past his defenses and taken root in the barren soil of his heart, was more than he could bear. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He pushed her away. He released her arm as if she had burned him. His expression shuddered, the fire in his eyes turning to ice. This was a mistake, he said, his voice harsh and cold. You cannot stay here. Clara stared at him, bewildered. He had just saved her, looked at her with an intensity that had stolen her breath, and now he was casting her out. What are you talking about? You are not safe here. You have seen what Croft is willing to do. You have brought this danger to my home. To Martha. He was not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, his face a mask of stone. Every word was a deliberate blow, designed to wound, to create distance. The accusation, though he may not have fully intended it, struck her deeply. You think I wanted this? You think I am to blame for the actions of a criminal? She asked, her voice rising with a mixture of hurt and indignation. I think your presence here is a complication I do not need, he said coldly. The stage leaves in 2 days. I will take you to town myself. You should go back to Boston. Back where you belong, back where you belong. The words echoed in the space between them, a cruel dismissal of everything she had started to feel for this place, for him. He was rejecting her, pushing her away with a coldness that was more painful than the threats of the two thugs. She looked at his rigid back, at the unyielding set of his shoulders, and she misunderstood his fear for disdain. She thought he saw her only as a liability, a fragile Eastern woman who was a danger to his ordered, solitary world. Her own pride, the same pride that had kept her from weeping on the station platform, came to her rescue. She lifted her chin, her own expression turning cool and distant to match his. "Very well," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "If I am such a burden, I will be glad to relieve you of it. I will start packing my things." Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the house, her back straight, her head held high. She did not look back to see the flicker of agony that crossed his face, the profound regret in his eyes as he watched her go. He had done it. He had pushed her away to keep her safe, to keep himself safe from the agony of loss. And in doing so, he had shattered the fragile, beautiful thing that had begun to grow between them, leaving them both more alone than ever. The next 2 days were an exercise in quiet misery. A thick, impenetrable wall of silence stood between Elias and Clara. They moved around each other in the small house like ghosts, their conversations limited to curt, necessary exchanges. Martha watched them with sad, knowing eyes. Her attempts to bridge the gap met with polite but firm resistance from both sides. Clara spent her time in her room, carefully packing her trunk, each folded garment a final admission of defeat. She was a fool to have come west, and a bigger fool to have thought, for even a moment, that she could build a life here, that the kindness of a stranger could blossom into something more. Elias threw himself into his work with a grim, punishing intensity. He rode the farthest reaches of his property, mending fences that did not need mending, checking on cattle that were perfectly fine. He was running, not from the threat of Croft's men, but from the aching void that had opened up inside him. Every corner of his ranch now reminded him of her. The kitchen, where he had watched her laugh with Martha as she learned to bake bread. The creek, where he had seen her arranging wildflowers in a jar. The porch, where he had seen her reading one of his books, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had brought light and life into his silent world, and he, in his terror, was about to extinguish it. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself it was the only way. But the words were hollow, a lie that offered no comfort. On the evening before she was due to leave, the sky turned a strange, ominous shade of orange and purple. The air grew heavy and still, the usual wind dying down to an unsettling calm. A storm was coming, a real one this time, far more violent than the one that had greeted her arrival. As darkness fell, the first flashes of lightning lit up the horizon, followed by the low, distant rumble of thunder. They ate their final meal together in that same suffocating silence. Clara picked at her food, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Elias stared into the fire, his face grim, the flickering light carving deep shadows into his features. Martha finally excused herself, unable to bear the tension any longer, retreating to her small room off the kitchen. Suddenly, Elias's head snapped up. His whole body went rigid, his senses on high alert. "What is it?" Clara asked, her own nerves stretched taut. "The dog is not barking," he said, his voice a low whisper. He kept a dog, a scruffy but loyal animal named Buster, who barked at anything that moved within 100 yards of the house. His silence was more alarming than any noise. Elias rose from his chair, moving with a silent, predatory grace. He took his rifle from its pegs above the mantelpiece, his movements swift and sure. "Stay away from the window," he commanded, his voice barely audible. He moved to the front window, peering cautiously through a crack in the curtains. Clara's heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear the rising wind howling around the corners of the house, the thunder growing closer. And then she heard another sound, a sound that made the blood run cold in her veins. The splintering of wood from the back of the house, followed by Martha's sharp, terrified cry. "They are here," Elias said, his voice devoid of all emotion except a deadly calm. They came in from the back. He shoved the heavy wooden table on its side, creating a makeshift barricade. "Get behind this, and do not make a sound." The back door burst open, and the two thugs scrambled in, dragging a whimpering Martha with them. The taller one held a pistol to her head. "Drop the rifle, Thorne," he snarled, his eyes wide with a desperate, greedy light. "Or the old woman gets it." Elias slowly lowered his rifle, his face a mask of controlled fury. His eyes met Clara's over the top of the overturned table, and in them, she saw a desperate, silent plea. He was trapped. To save Martha, he had to surrender. "That is better," the man said, shoving Martha roughly to the floor. "Now, we want the girl and the money. We know she has it here. The money is not here," Elias said, his voice steady. "And you're not taking her," the second man laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "You're not in a position to be making demands." He raised his own pistol, aiming it at Elias's chest. The world seemed to shrink to the confines of that fire-lit room. The storm raged outside, a furious counterpoint to the deadly standoff within. Clara huddled behind the table, her mind racing. She was not a passive victim. She would not be. This was her fault. Her presence had brought this violence to these good people. She had to do something. Her eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her gaze fell on the hearth. Next to the roaring fire was a set of heavy iron tools, a poker, a shovel, and a heavy iron skillet Martha used for cooking bacon, left on the stone to warm. It was thick and black and solid. While the two men were focused on Elias, their attention divided between him and Martha on the floor. Clara began to move. She crept along the floor, using the overturned table as cover, her movements slow and silent. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but the sound was lost in the howl of the wind and the crack of thunder. Dash! Elias saw her moving. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, but he gave no other sign. He had to keep their attention on him. "You think Croft is going to pay you?" he said, his voice a low taunt. "A man like that? He'll put a bullet in your back the second you hand her over." "Shut up!" the tall one snapped, his focus wavering for just a second. It was the opening they needed. In that instant, everything happened at once. Clara reached the hearth. She grabbed the iron skillet, its handle still warm from the fire. It was heavier than she expected, but adrenaline gave her strength. As the second man turned his head toward the sound of Elias's voice, Clara rose up from behind the table. With a cry that was part fear and part rage, she swung the heavy skillet with all her might, bringing it down on the man's gun hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a scream of agony. The pistol clattered to the floor. The man staggered back, clutching his shattered hand. The distraction was all Elias needed. He lunged forward, not for his rifle, but for the first man. He moved with the speed and brutality of a cornered grizzly bear. He slammed the man against the wall, the impact shaking the entire cabin. The man's pistol went off, the shot going wild, burying itself in the ceiling beams. Elias disarmed him with a swift, brutal twist of the wrist, and then a single, powerful punch sent the man slumping to the floor, unconscious. The second man, howling in pain, made a desperate grab for his fallen gun with his good hand. But Elias was already there. He kicked the gun away, sending it skittering into a dark corner of the room. He hauled the man to his feet and subdued him with a cold, terrifying efficiency that left Clara breathless. The fight was over in less than a minute. The only sounds in the room were the crackling fire, the raging storm, and the ragged, desperate gasps of four people breathing in the aftermath of violence. Elias stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. He had tied the conscious man with rope from the woodpile, his movements quick and precise. He turned to Martha, helping her to her feet, his voice suddenly gentle. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Elias. Just shaken," she said, her voice trembling but steady. She looked at Clara, who was still standing by the hearth, the heavy skillet clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. A look of profound respect and admiration dawned on the older woman's face. Then Elias turned to Clara. He walked slowly toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. The cold mask was gone, shattered by the violence and the terror of the last few minutes. All his walls, all his carefully constructed defenses had been torn down. What was left was raw, unguarded, and intensely vulnerable. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He looked at the skillet in her hands, then back at her face, which was smudged with soot and streaked with tears. She had not even realized she was crying. He saw not a fragile Eastern lady, but a warrior, a woman who had faced down her fear to protect them. The thought of what he had almost lost, what he had been about to willingly send away, crashed over him with the force of a physical blow. He reached out and gently took the heavy skillet from her hands, setting it on the hearth. Then his hands came up to cup her face, his calloused thumbs wiping away her tears. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. The dam of his control finally broke. All the years of solitude, of repressed grief and fear, came pouring out. "I was a fool," he said, his voice cracking. "I was so afraid. When I lost Sarah and Lily, a part of me died with them. I swore I would never feel that kind of pain again. I built this place, this life, as a fortress against feeling anything at all." He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a desperate, possessive embrace. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent as if it were air itself. "And then you came," he murmured against her ear. "You walked into my life, and you filled up all the empty spaces. You brought light into this house. And it terrified me, because I started to feel again. I started to care. And the thought of losing you, it was more than I could bear. That is why I pushed you away. Not because you were a burden, but because you had become the most important thing in my world, and I could not stand the thought of what it would feel like to lose you too." He pulled back just enough to look in her eyes, his own stormy gray eyes shining with unshed tears. "I thought I stayed in this valley because it was all I had left of them, a place to serve out my sentence of loneliness. But I was wrong." He took a shaky breath, the final confession torn from the deepest part of his soul. "I want to stay because of you. Because you are the only place that has ever felt like home since I lost them." Clara's heart, which had been frozen with fear and sorrow, seemed to melt at his words. The truth of his confession, so raw and painful and beautiful, washed away all the hurt and misunderstanding. She saw the lonely, wounded man who had hidden his heart away for so long, and she loved him with a fierce, sudden intensity that took her breath away. She raised a hand to his cheek, her touch gentle. "Oh, Elias," she whispered, "you do not have to be alone anymore." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of fear and hope, of two lonely souls finding solace in each other amidst the wreckage of a storm. It was a promise made in the heart of the firelight, a vow that the silence was finally, truly over. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. By dawn, the sky was washed clean, a pale, hopeful blue. Sheriff Brody and his deputies arrived, alerted by a ranch hand from a neighboring property who had seen the lamps burning at Elias's place all night and sensed trouble. They took the two battered and bound thugs into custody, their expressions a mixture of grim satisfaction and respect for the way the situation had been handled. In the quiet aftermath, the ranch house felt different. The violence had exorcised the last of the ghosts, and the silence that settled was not one of loneliness, but of peace. Martha, with her usual quiet resilience, set about making coffee and breakfast, her movements calm and reassuring, a quiet affirmation that life would go on. After the sheriff had left, Elias found Clara on the porch. She was watching the sunrise paint the mountains in hues of rose and gold. He came to stand beside her, a steaming mug of coffee in each hand. He passed one to her, their fingers brushing. The small touch was electric, a confirmation of the new reality between them. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the new day be born. The air was fresh and clean, scrubbed by the rain, and smelled of wet earth and sage. "Clara," Elias said finally, his voice soft. He turned to face her, taking her free hand in his. "What I said last night, I meant every word, I know," she replied, her heart full. "I did not want you to leave," he continued, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I want you to stay. I want you to build a life with me." Here, he reached into the small pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a simple, delicate ring. It was a thin band of worn gold, with a tiny, intricately carved flower on it. It was old and clearly cherished. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She gave it to me for the woman I would one day love with my whole heart. My first wife, Sarah, never wore it. It did not feel right somehow. We were young, and our love was a bright new thing. This ring, it feels like it has been waiting. It speaks of a love that has endured storms, a love that knows what it is to have and to lose, and to find hope again on the other side. It feels like it was waiting for you. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she looked from the beautiful, simple ring to the earnest, hopeful face of the man holding it. This strong, silent man who had walled himself off from the world was now offering her the most vulnerable part of himself, his future. "Clara Davenport," he said, his voice shaking slightly, a testament to the magnitude of the moment. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" She did not need to think. Her answer was in the joyous, tearful smile that spread across her face. "Yes, Elias Thorne," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It felt as if it had always belonged there. He drew her into his arms, and this time, the embrace was not one of desperation, but of profound, peaceful joy. It was the embrace of two people who had found their safe harbor, their true home, in each other. Word of the attack and the subsequent engagement traveled through Redemption Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. The initial shock gave way to a groundswell of support for the couple. The townspeople, who had once whispered about the strange pairing of the reclusive rancher and the refined lady from the East, now saw them in a new light. They saw a man who had finally found a reason to rejoin the world, and a woman whose courage and resilience had earned their deepest respect. They were married a month later, in a simple ceremony held in the small grove of aspen trees by the creek where Clara had been attacked. It was her choice. She wanted to reclaim the spot, to transform a place of fear into a place of love. The entire town seemed to turn out for the occasion. Sheriff Brody stood as Elias's best man, and Martha, her eyes shining with tears, stood by Clara's side. The station master, Mr. Gable, gave her away, his chest puffed out with fatherly pride. The town came together to help them celebrate. The women brought food for a feast, and the men helped Elias repair the damage to his house, replacing the splintered back door and patching the bullet hole in the ceiling. It was a community embracing two of its own, a celebration not just of a marriage, but of healing and new beginnings. As Clara stood beside Elias, repeating her vows under the whispering leaves of the aspens, she looked out at the faces of her new friends, her new family. She had come to this land seeking a home and had been met with deception and danger. But through it all, she had found something far more real and precious than the life she had been promised. She had found her own strength. She had found a community, and she had found a deep and abiding love with the solitary man who had shown her that home was not a place on a map, but a feeling of belonging in another person's heart. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley. The Thorne Ranch was thriving. A new wing had been added to the log house, its fresh-cut pine still fragrant in the warm air. The corrals were larger, and the herd of cattle that grazed peacefully in the distance had doubled in size. The scars of the past had healed, leaving behind a landscape of prosperity and peace. Clara sat in a rocking chair on the expanded front porch, a book lying open but forgotten in her lap. The soft cotton of her dress was stretched taut over the gentle swell of her belly. Their second child was due in the autumn. At her feet, a small boy with his father's stormy gray eyes and a shock of his mother's honey blonde hair was carefully stacking wooden blocks. Daniel, their son, was 1.5 years old, a whirlwind of happy energy who had filled the house with the sound of laughter and joy, sounds Elias had once thought he would never hear again. She watched as Elias rode in from the fields. He no longer looked like the haunted, solitary man she had first met on that dusty station platform. The harsh lines on his face had been softened by smiles. The guarded watchfulness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, contented warmth. He was still quiet, still a man of few words, but his silence was no longer born of pain. It was the comfortable, easy silence of a man at peace with his world. He swung down from his horse, his movements still as fluid and graceful as ever, and his eyes immediately found her on the porch. A slow, easy smile spread across his face, a smile that was reserved only for her and their son. Daniel squealed with delight, abandoning his blocks and toddling toward his father on unsteady legs. "Papa." Elias swept the boy up into his arms, tossing him gently into the air. Daniel's delighted shrieks echoed in the quiet air. Elias settled him on his hip and walked onto the porch, his boots making a familiar, comforting sound on the wooden planks. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to Clara's lips. "Everything all right out here?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Perfectly all right," she said, her hand coming to rest on his as he placed it on her swollen belly. "He has been kicking all afternoon. I think this one will be a rider, just like his father," Elias chuckled, his gaze full of a love so profound it still made her heart ache with its beauty. He looked from his wife to his son, then out at the land spread before them, his land, their land. The sun was setting behind the mountains, bathing the valley in a warm, ethereal glow. The wind whispered through the pines, a gentle lullaby. He had once seen this land as a kingdom of emptiness, a place of penance. Now he saw it as a paradise, a sanctuary filled with everything that mattered. He had thought that love was a weakness, a door left open for pain. But Clara had taught him that love was a fortress, the only true shelter against the storms of life. It was a source of strength, a reason for being. He looked back at his wife, her face radiant in the golden light, and his heart was so full it felt as though it might burst. All the years of loneliness, all the grief and the hardship had been but a long, winding road that had, against all odds, led him here. To this porch, to this woman, to this life. "This is home," he said softly, the words a simple statement of a complex and beautiful truth. Clara smiled, her own eyes shining with love. "Yes," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder as their son babbled happily in his arms. "It always was.